What is up, APUSH? It is Saturday morning, and we are tackling our final unit for the AP test. That is Unit 7, Period 7, which of course is 1890 to 1945. Why 1890 to 1945? Let us discuss. 1890, of course, is the closing of the frontier. Closing of the frontier should give us knowledge that this is where the United States is no longer expanding west by lands into Native American territory. Now the United States is expanding overseas and creating various colonies overseas, such as the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, all of these things that can be all in this era of imperialism by the United States. So, of course, one of the key themes is definitely American imperialism, Hawaii, and the Spanish American War. Then you really should be able to know a breakdown of all of the major decades in the 20th century. Now, the AP test is only taking us till 1945, which is a shame because I think you guys, have a really good knowledge of the 20th century. But regardless, we should know all of these major themes of the first half of the 20th century. 1901 to 1914, that's our progressive era. And if we're talking in the context about what we learned this week with the Gilded Age, we are in drastic need of change, of progressives coming in and giving the federal government power to be able to regulate the economy in ways that it has not been able to do so before. Not just the economy, obviously, big business needs to be tamed, but also things like in creating bureaucracies to help the slums in the cities, creating bureaucracies that are going to come in and help with sanitation and the quality of food, protecting the environment, all these things. And so this time period is a huge expansion of the federal government time period. That is one of the biggest themes of this time period is the expansion of the federal government. 1914 to 1918, of course, is World War One. In both world wars, the United States is going to respect our isolationist tradition. However, eventually get sucked into the war. We know that after World War One, we had a huge debate over joining the League of Nations and ratifying that Treaty of Versailles that certainly affects American politics in many different ways. The 1920s, we sink back into isolationism. There's also a fear of immigrants, especially because of the first Red Scare with Russia becoming communist. And so that will help define the 1920s, as well as very, very conservative politics. This is a time of great wealth, the roaring 20s. So every time the United States goes through periods of great wealth, we see very conservative politics. We see our presidents that are going to be hands off, more laissez-faire, not regulating business. And then, of course, with the stock market crash in 1929, we see that as the final tipping point to bring the United States in the Great Depression in the 1930s. Of course, the Great Depression, as far as American politics, is all about FDR's New Deal domestically. And then, of course, the 1930s is also going to see the rise of fascism in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, and then many other totalitarian very nationalist governments are going to emerge in places like Japan as well. At first, of course, the U.S. is going to stay isolated all throughout the 1930s, but in 1939, FDR directly starts supporting Britain against Nazi Germany. And then, of course, we get sucked into the war on December 7th, 1941, which, of course, is Pearl Harbor. Our key dates are listed here. There are more key dates in this unit than other key dates because I am asking for a more complete understanding of each decade, because there is a big ebb and flow of the first half of the 20th century in which politics change many times, and they change dramatically. And so 1901, that's one we should know because that is Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. He's a social Darwinist internationally. He's also a progressive at home. And so that is the start of the progressive era. 1920, of course, the 19th Amendment with women getting the right to vote. We also have two acts on immigration with the Emergency Quota Act and the Immigration Act of 1924. Both of those are good ones to know because they are radical changes to American immigration policy. Of course, the stock market crashed in 1929. FDR with our New Deal coalition, that's shifting the Democratic Party into where it is today. And then, of course, December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Here are what the College Board gives us as our must-know terms. We will cover each and every one of these terms as we go through the next 2 days worth of screencasts. In the beginning, the left column over here, the Frontier Thesis, that is our closing the frontier in 1890. The Spanish-American War, of course, which we'll start with today, which is obviously one of our most imperialist wars, perhaps besides the Mexican-American War. Philippine insurrection comes with it. And then, of course, our progressive era. Okay, so this is in the College Board's words. An increasingly pluralistic United States faced profound domestic and global challenges, debated the proper degree of government activism, and sought to define its international role. I put in yellow 2 parts of this. Government activism. This is our big shift domestically. In the Gilded Age, it's all about our forgettable presidents, our laissez-faire presidents. They're very, very hands-off. We see that with the progressive era, the federal government expands and looks to directly come in and help individuals that are being oppressed. That is really our progressive era. And then defining its international role. The United States has been very vacant in international affairs outside of the Western Hemisphere for pretty much its entire history up until this point, with obvious exceptions of the Revolutionary War and our War of 1812. I mean, everything else, the only really other conflict that we get into is the Mexican-American War. Of course, the Civil War, but the Civil War isn't an international conflict. In this time period, we are going to be getting involved in lots of international conflicts. This is the U.S. expanding and becoming a world power. Okay, so talked about our key themes already. We can go past this. Let's get into American imperialism. So lots of reasons for American imperialism in this era. One is overproduction. That's perhaps the most important reason. We have overproducing farmers. We have overproducing factories. They're looking to export their goods to new markets. Therefore, American imperialism would bring new markets into the empire and therefore provide consumers for American manufactured or farmed goods. Also, a prevailing belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority rears its ugly head in this time period, really started by Europeans in their initial start of imperialism in the era, where we see, for instance, the British in India or the scramble for Africa. This is going to set the tone with this belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority. And then that interpretation of Darwinism, that social Darwinism, where it was suggested, obviously, by Darwin that there are some groups that are more evolved, that are more advanced than other groups. And this is twisted in a scientifically racist way to suggest that Anglo-Saxons are more evolved because they went through, because England and the United States went through the Industrial Revolution before other parts of the world, and therefore they are more evolved and advanced, and that therefore imperialism is only spreading, quote, more of the best, that idea. Always when you see imperialism, we have missionaries seeking converts. Josiah Strong, one of our outspoken missionaries looking for more converts in the time period. The scramble for Africa, of course, and then the scramble for China as well. That's a big one too. China becomes divided with the spheres of influence in this time period. So lots of international pressure by the United States, where the Western Europe especially is starting to take over the world. And the United States feels like it's getting left behind, and therefore it's going to rationalize imperialism in order to stay a world power and become even more of a world power. And that's especially added to by Captain Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which is glorifying the Navy and becoming a powerful state in the world. Okay, so the British Guyana-Venezuela dispute was one of our early situations. This is actually under President Cleveland, and the reason why it becomes important in this area is because this is a situation going on in the Western Hemisphere. And the British have a colony here, which they've had for a long time. and it's on the colony or on the border of Venezuela. And there is gold discovered in an area where it's not quite sure whose land it is. Is it Venezuela? Is it Guyana? And because of this, the British are looking to come in and establish, put some troops in there to claim the area for themselves. Well, by coming into this to Venezuela, that is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which of course was established in 1823 with President Monroe. Cleveland is going to look at this as a threat, and under the context that Europeans are invading all over the world, it's rational that Cleveland looks at it this way. And so he's going to invoke the Monroe Doctrine. He's going to stay out of here, or there's going to be problems. Britain replies, it's none of your business. And so it looks like we may have a conflict with Britain here. But we see Kaiser Wilhelm mobilizing in Europe. We also have the Boer Wars in South Africa that Britain has to deal with. And because of this, Britain backs off. And this is our last time that we are going to have a conflict with Britain. Up until this point, Britain has been our biggest adversary in U.S. history. After this point, Britain becomes our most trusted ally. Okay, so Hawaii. So Hawaii, from its very discovery by Americans, was used as a way station looking for markets out in Asia, especially China. And we saw lots of shippers and merchants stopping in Hawaii to refuel and then moving on. Then came the missionaries and people looking to buy land for the cultivating of sugar. More and more Americans, especially rich Americans, came in, started buying and monopolizing the land in Hawaii. And by doing this, what happens as a result, of course, is that because the Hawaiians, the native indigenous Hawaiians, were in such isolation from the West, they succumbed to American disease, old world disease, old world pathogens, and 5/6 of the population in Hawaii died. Tragic amount of death because once again of almost a later Columbian exchange, if you will. Because of this, just as the encomienda system broke down for the Spanish because the natives would perish from disease, we are going to see our American sugar plantation owners import Asian laborers coming over from especially Japan to come in and work on these sugar plantations. And by 1900, there's more Chinese and Japanese working on these sugar plantations than there are native Hawaiians. And so now the question is Japan going to come in and annex Hawaii, especially given that Japan has become especially imperialist in this era? They've already fought China and started to gain a protectorate in Korea. They've also taken Taiwan from China. And so it looks as though Japan might come in and annex Hawaii, and that is going to scare the United States. And then we see a spark for the annexation of Hawaii, and that is the McKinley Tariff. This is in Benjamin Harrison's presidency, but McKinley, of course, becomes the American president. But the tariff is a hugely high tariff, our highest tariff in American peacetime history up until this point. And why the tariff is such an issue is because Hawaii technically, of course, is not part of the United States. And so at this stage, of course, we have all these American sugar planters that are living in Hawaii. But now that we have this high tariff, these American sugar planters are having to compete with domestic producers at home that are protected by those tariffs. And so our rich Americans over living in Hawaii are going to start to push for the annexation of Hawaii. But of course, there's a problem with that. We have a monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, who says, no way, Hawaii needs to be run by Hawaiians. We have a government here. We have a monarchy here. We have something in place. There's no need to join the United States. And so the United States is going to use imperialism to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. There's a rebellion on the island in 1893 where U.S. troops show up after the U.S. minister in Honolulu sends a telegraph saying the Hawaiian pear is fully ripe, and now is the golden era to pluck it. And because of this, American troops move in, push out Hawaiian resistance. And at the time, our Republican president, Benjamin Harrison is looking to annex Hawaii in 1893. However, before he can do it, he's out of office. Here comes Grover Cleveland for his second term. Grover Cleveland looks at the situation, sees that Americans have drastically done wrong to the Hawaiians, and so opposes annexations because he believes it's morally wrong. And it won't fully be annexed until the Spanish-American War in 1898, as the McKinley administration sees the benefits of having Hawaii, given that we're needing to send troops over to the Philippines as part of that war. Speaking of that war, the Spanish-American War, we have Cubans revolting against the Spanish. The Spanish are first imperializers, are colonizers of the New World. The Spanish had this massive empire throughout South America, Central America, and the previous Western United States. But they have lost most of their empire at this stage and only now hold a Caribbean empire in the Philippines. So the Cubans are now revolting against the Spanish, as they've actually done many times before. And one of the biggest reasons why is that things are hard times in Cuba because there's an economic downturn once again caused by that McKinley tariff. It's becoming very difficult to export sugar into the United States now because of this high tariff. And so the Cubans are going to rebel against the Spanish. They're going to burn their own cane fields. But we have lots of American investments in Cuba, 50 million of property in Cuba, and it's a very, very important trade partner with the United States. And because of this, there's a worry that Americans are being threatened, American properties being threatened there. And so Cuba becomes a very important stimulus for the Spanish-American War. Our causes for that war, first of all, is the treatment of Cubans in Cuba, because our Spanish are going to come in and start herding civilians into concentration camps. The insurrectos, the Cuban revolutionaries, are rebelling against the Spanish. And so our Spanish don't know who is helping the revolutionaries. They start herding everybody into concentration camps. And these conditions of these concentration camps are nasty. There's disease, poor sanitation. Hundreds start to die. And then we have American journalists that are coming in and sensationalizing what's going on in Cuba. William Randolph Hearst, for instance, is going to hire an artist to go over to Cuba and start drawing pictures of the atrocities there. And he says, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. And he's really exaggerating or making up situations in which apparently these travesties are occurring over there. This is called yellow journalism, or the really inflation of the truth. And this is obviously a big cause of the Spanish-American War. The Delome letter is another one. The Spanish minister in D.C. Is reporting back to Spain on the conditions of politics in the United States. And he is saying, I don't think McKinley will do anything about our treatment of Cubans. He says he is a weak man that is beholden to the views of his people. And this is then intercepted illegally, I might add, and then makes its way over to William Randolph Hearst, who publishes this. Then this infuriates Americans because you're insulting their president. And then, of course, the USS Maine, the American Navy ship that was sent over to Cuba to help evacuate Americans from the violence over there. An explosion occurs, 260 die. The American government says it was a submarine by the Spanish. The Spanish say it was a mistake. It was some sort of internal explosion. Of course, we now know it was an internal explosion, but it doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters about perception. And so Americans yell, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And here we go. We are now coming into a war with Spain. The American diplomats are going to come over to Spain. They're going to say, you need to end concentration camps. You need to stop fighting against the rebels. The Spanish immediately do those things. And yet the whole country is still clamoring for war. And McKinley doesn't know what to do. But at the end of the day, he wants Cuba. He looks at Cuba as a very valuable piece to an American empire. And because of this, he is going to ask Congress to go to war to free the oppressed Cubans. That is actually in his appeal to Congress, that he is looking to free the oppressed Cubans. And because of this, because that is such a big part of his asking of Congress, Congress is going to pass the Teller Amendment, which is a self-denying amendment because it states that once the U.S. overthrows the Spanish in Cuba, that Cuba will be given their freedom. And that is an interesting amendment, certainly, because it is denying the United States from really using full-scale imperialism here. So, of course, where do you start a war to free the oppressed Cubans? You started in the Philippines, which of course makes no sense, but that's exactly what happens. Teddy Roosevelt, here as the Assistant Navy Secretary in the U.S. government, is going to order Commodore George Dewey to be ready to attack the Philippines. And then the United States declares war, and that same day, Teddy Roosevelt is going to order Dewey and his fleet to invade the port city at Manila, and they surprise attack the Spanish. They destroy their entire fleet there, 400 Spanish casualties, not a single American loss of life. And this is kind of how the Spanish-American War goes in general. It is certainly a massacre at the hands of the United States against the Spanish. Problem is that once Dewey has defeated the Spanish Navy there in Manila, they have no soldiers to come and actually invade the land. And so they have to wait months before soldiers arrive and they can actually invade Manila. One of the reasons in why Hawaii becomes a territory so quickly in this war, because it's a way station that's going to allow American soldiers to make it there quickly. Filipino revolutionaries are going to aid the United States against the Spanish here in the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo is our revolutionary leader. He was actually brought out of exile by the United States to come help in this revolution for the Philippines. And then Emilio Aguinaldo, thinking, of course, that the Philippines will be independent after this war, is going to be deeply frustrated at the United States when, in fact, the United States does not give the Philippines independence. And so Emilio Aguinaldo is an important figure because not only does he help the United States against the Spanish, he's then going to fight the United States for Philippine independence. Okay, Cuba. So the Spanish are going to send in their navy to the Santiago harbor there. The U.S. much superior navy is going to come in and blockade that navy, so they have nowhere to go. Then the American army is going to attack the ships by lands. That's where the Rough Riders become famous. Teddy Roosevelt has resigned as assistant Navy secretary. He's come in to lead soldiers in this war. He writes about his exploits in the Rough Riders. He shoots a Spaniard in the gut, and he writes about that. Becomes very popular and famous for these sort of things. And it is certainly a quick war in Cuba and an even quicker war in Puerto Rico. And the U.S. actually moves to Puerto Rico and invades Puerto Rico even already as discussions of peace were being made. And really, that was clearly the most obvious act of imperialism in this entire thing, because Puerto Rico really didn't have any strategic significance to the Spanish here in this war. This was a land grab by the United States. And so the Treaty of Paris in 1898, we see that Guam, Puerto Rico, Philippines are becoming U.S. territories. Guam, of course, in the Pacific, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines in the Pacific. The U.S. is going to pay $20 million for damages. And here's our treaty. But of course, as we know, and we should of course be reminded before we get to World War I, that you can send over delegates to Paris and you can meet with the Spanish and they can come back with this wonderful treaty that had been agreed on by both sides in Paris. But you need to come back and have it ratified by the Senate. That is how our U.S. Constitution works. And there is a debate over this treaty. And why is it such a debate? Is because we have a different situation than the U.S. has had before when it comes to gaining land, except for Hawaii, which has just been added to the Union. When the U.S. has come in and gained more land, for instance, the Louisiana Purchase or the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Cession, it was thinly populated and it was connected to the United States. This is a very different situation after the Spanish-American War. The Philippines have 7 million people there. They're a different culture, language, different government. This is certainly empire building. right? This is very different than before. And we have many people that are outspokenly against it. This is our anti-imperialist league. They don't like that the U.S. is imposing their flag upon other people. They find it anti-American and anti-democratic. And certainly they have a point. Um, some of the most outspoken anti-imperialists: Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, Andrew Carnegie. So some of the more well-known Americans, certainly. And the Puerto Rico situation, and actually extended to the Philippines as well, um, is really one of the most outward showings of social Darwinism in this time. Because okay, the Puerto Rico has been added and annexed by the United States, and that immediately brings the question: okay, so Puerto Ricans, what are they now? Are they Americans? Are they citizens? Do they get to vote? Do they have all the protections of the Bill of Rights? What is the situation here? So the United States is hesitant to give all of the rights that Americans have to Puerto Ricans. Congress passes the Foraker Act that says, okay, you can somewhat rule yourselves. And we'll give you eventual citizenship in 1917. But then the question is, okay, well, what about tariffs? What about our 14th Amendment with equal protection under the law? We see Puerto Ricans are going to try and sue and come to the Supreme Court over issues of citizenship and protection of their rights. And in the Supreme Court, the insular cases decide that Puerto Ricans are unique, that they do not have all the constitutional rights that are guaranteed by all Americans, because they are subject to American rule. And these cases largely still stand in Puerto Rico today, 103 years later. Wow. All right, so the Platt Amendment, we've got Cuba. So, of course, the Teller Amendment had stated that the United States would not annex Cuba, would not take over Cuba after the Spanish-American War, that they would leave, the Americans would leave Cuba. And so the United States fulfills this promise, and yet they're going to make the Cubans include something in their constitution called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is indirect control of Cuba by the United States, meaning in this Platt Amendment, the Cubans can't enter any treaties that may compromise its independence, according to the United States. Cubans can't take on any debt because of fear of a European power coming in and invading Cuba. They can't. The U.S. can intervene with troops whenever it wants, and the United States takes the best leasing coaling stations as well as naval stations in Cuba, including, of course, the famous Guantanamo Bay. The Philippines, very, very hypocritical treatment by the Filipinos, by the United States. Nasty, nasty betrayal of the Philippines by the United States, because the U.S. Came in and used Filipino revolutionaries to fight against the Spanish, and then proceeded to not give them their independence and annex the Philippines into the United States. And certainly the Filipinos, they're not happy with that. All they want is their independence. And in 1899, the Filipinos start to fight back against U.S. military occupation, once again led by Emilio Aguinaldo. The U.S. is going to have to deploy more troops to the Philippines than it used against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. 2 years later, capturing Aguinaldo, which is the start and the end of organized resistance by the Philippines. All told, we see 4,234 American deaths, mostly at the hands of disease, and a tremendous amount of Filipino deaths, over 500,000 Filipino deaths in this very hypocritical, nasty, imperialist occupation of the Philippines. China. So the United States is very, very late to the game in imperialism of China. The British started imperialism of China in the 1840s, 1842 with the Opium Wars, which took Hong Kong. After that, movement, we started to see the British come in and take more and more economic control of China, followed by the French. Then the Japanese are going to come in and defeat the Chinese in 1894, 1895 with the first Sino-Japanese War. And now all of Europe is coming in for a mad scramble for the Chinese. Now, the United States does not have any land in China. It doesn't have any economic control over China. But the United States has emerged as one of the most powerful countries in the world, perhaps the most powerful military, behind only Great Britain. And so the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay is going to propose something called the open door policy. There should be free trade and extraterritorial rights in all of China, regardless of who owns a sphere of influence in which part of China. This is going to introduce free trade there. And while many European nations are unhappy about this, Europe is quite distracted with its own militarism in Western Europe itself, with Kaiser Wilhelm, etc. Nobody really directly challenges this. And so the US manufacturers and farmers get a huge economic bonus by being able to export their goods to China tax-free. Of course, the Chinese are very unhappy about this, and this is the end of the Qing dynasty in China. And we have our Empress Dowager that is going to call upon the Chinese people to push out the foreigners. That's called our Boxers' Rebellion, or Order of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. However, Western Europe and the United States are going to put down this rebellion and force the Chinese to pay them indemnities, which means money for damages, and they have to pay $333 million in damages, $24 million to the United States. So poor China has gone through a tremendous amount of imperialism in this time period, some at the hands of the United States. Then Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901 because McKinley, unfortunately, is assassinated by an anarchist in Buffalo. He was easily reelected in the election of 1900. Remember, he was elected in 1896 against William Jennings Bryan. That was actually one of our key elections. It was a big election. And he's reelected triumphantly in 1900 because he's a successful president. He was presided over the United States. He won a war. He expanded, grabbed real estate. So very popular. However, he's murdered. And his first-term vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, now becomes president of the United States, our youngest president of all time. And he is not the youngest to be elected president. That would be JFK, but he is the youngest president, of course, because he comes into power with McKinley's assassination. Teddy Roosevelt is a much, much different person than McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt is a believer that anything that the Constitution says the president can't do is the only thing that's going to stop him from taking action in the federal government. Meaning, if the Constitution doesn't specifically say the president can't do it, then he believes he can do it. He is going to bring a tremendous amount of gravitas and confidence to the presidency and drastically expand the federal government just by sheer force of will and personality. Of course, he has his flaws. He is certainly a social Darwinist. He is certainly a proponent of big military intervention with his big stick policy. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. Be prepared militarily. And we first see these actions down in the Central American country of Panama. The Spanish-American War brought up new discussions of a canal in Panama, and this had already been proposed by many European nations in the United States. Back in 1850, the U.S. and Britain had agreed to the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which said that both these nations would work together to build a canal and split the profits themselves. However, now that the UK is in the Boer War in South Africa, they signed a new treaty, the Hay-Paunce-Bote Treaty, which says the US is free to build a canal there. But where to build it? Because the French had already tried this before. They had tried to build a canal in Panama, and they went bankrupt, largely because of disease there, especially yellow fever had moved through. It was nasty, and they had really dug almost a third of the canal, but had gone bankrupt in the process, and they wanted to sell their incomplete project to somebody. It now looks like the U.S. after this Hay-Paunce-Bote Treaty. Okay, looks like no problem. We can sell our canal. But there's a problem. Because as you can see from this map, Panama, this is the rightful place. It looks like a great place. It's very narrow. We could build a canal there, but Panama is not in control of its own autonomy. It's not sovereign. It is being controlled by Colombia, the much bigger South American state down here. And so now the question is, will Colombia allow a canal to be built in Panama. Congress is going to offer Colombia $10 million plus they'll give annual payments to Colombia for the usage of a canal once built. Colombia is going to reject that offer, and that proves to be a mistake because the United States, now with its new built navy, is going to help the Panamanians become independent of Colombia. The Panamanians revolt. Colombia is going to send in its navy to put down this revolt, and very conveniently, U.S. warships are already there. They prevent Colombian help, and as a result, Panama becomes independent. Immediately, they are now the Republic of Panama, and they're going to name Philip Vinal Varela as prime minister. The irony of this is Vinal Varela is a Frenchman who is actually was the president of the French canal building company that had started the Panama Canal in the first place. So obviously here, the person being named prime minister is named prime minister out of expediency to get this Panama Canal built. And that is exactly what happens with our Vinal Varela Treaty. The canal is sold exclusively to the United States for $40 million. It is completed in 1914, the first year of World War I. Now this becomes an invaluable economic asset to the United States, because now you won't have to sail all the way around South America to make it over to the eastern part of the United States, which of course is tremendously important for transportation, for shipping, for military reasons. But the side effect of this is it's a very ugly downturn in relations with Latin America, which of course has looked at the U.S. very suspiciously as the Colossus of the North since the Mexican-American War. I will say, however, guys, that we will see an upturn in relations with Latin America with FDR. He was our good neighbor, our really one president that is able to come in and mend relations. And this certainly will not help in relations with Latin America, because Teddy Roosevelt is a social Darwinist, as I've said, and he is going to be very heavy-handed in Latin America and the Caribbean. We see many countries in Latin America start to become in debt, with many upturns in their politics, the Caudillos seizing power, Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, two of these such countries that are in deep debt with European creditors. And in the age of imperialism, if you fall into debt to a European country, more likely than not, that European country is going to come in and forcefully collect that debt, and in the process, take over your country, or at least take over some of the valuable lands that you have. And so Teddy Roosevelt is not going to allow this to happen, and he is going to announce a policy of preventative intervention. And what that means is, if he sees a country in Latin America or the Caribbean falling into debt, that the U.S. will say, as part of the Monroe Doctrine, which says that you cannot come in and colonize in the Western Hemisphere, we are going to come in and invade that country first. We're going to take over their economy. We are going to get the money that you need, European nation. We are going to send that money to you, and then we will make sure that you don't come into the Western Hemisphere. And so what this really is thinly veiled American imperialism justifying invading countries in Latin America for the purpose of protecting them from European nations. And so this starts a policy of the U.S. continually invading in countries in the Caribbean, for instance, Dominican Republic and Cuba in 1906. Once again, Latin America views the United States as the Colossus of the North. Nasty relations in California once again. There is now an influx of Japanese immigrants coming into California. In Japan, the Industrial Revolution is fully hit, and it has caused the same changes that occurred to the United States in the Gilded Age. Lots of very, very poor working conditions, and thus many Japanese immigrants leave Japan and look for a better life somewhere else, coming to California. 1906, we have a huge earthquake in San Francisco, fires. The economy of California is unfortunately hit pretty hard by this. And so when economic things turn bad, in history, the United States is largely blamed immigrants. And so here we have a situation where we see outright and overt racism here. The San Francisco School Board starts segregating Asian students into separate schools. Obviously, everyone involved is going to be hit by this and insulted by this. The Japanese government's insulted by this. And now we have a situation in which the treatment in San Francisco of Japanese citizens could lead to an international conflict. This might lead us to war right here. And so Teddy Roosevelt correctly is going to see this situation. He's going to invite the San Francisco School Board to come to the White House. And he actually does this twice. He does this one time with the San Francisco School Board. He does this another time with coal miners and the owners of coal mines. And he is going to negotiate a settlement with this San Francisco School Board in which he says you cannot segregate Asian students into separate schools. I'll talk to the Japanese government. That's exactly what he does. And with the Japanese government, he makes an agreement that says, for the time being, stop the flow of Japanese laborers coming into the American mainland. They can still go to Hawaii. And then we, in return, will make sure that the people already here will get proper treatment. That's called the gentleman's agreement. And he kind of pleads with the Japanese government to do this. And then after he makes this agreement, he feels like, oh, does this make me look weak? He was a big egotist, Teddy Roosevelt. And because of this, he decides, I'm going to show the strength of the United States. And so he comes up with this plan to impress the Japanese. He sends 16 warships around the world. They were white warships, and so it was called the Great White Fleet. But again, nasty racial connotations to this. They stop in many different places. They stop in Australia. They stop in Europe. And ironically enough, the highlight of the trip was when they sailed by Japan. This is supposed to be this great showing of military strength, but the Japanese come out in kimonos. They're waving American flags. They sing the Star-Spangled Banner. And so it was actually the warmest moment of the trip as far as relations. And in these warm spirits, the Root Takahira Treaty is signed, in which both powers, Japan and the United States, agree to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific, the possessions in the Pacific that the U.S. have currently, Guam and the Philippines, of course. Ironically, this will not be respected as we see the Japanese start to invade lands in the Pacific in the wake of the World War II. Domestically, we have our progressive movement starting with the election, or I should say, becoming of president of Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. The progressive era is largely about expanding the power of the government to be able to give welfare to people that need it the most in this post-Gilded Age era. There are so many problems that need to be fixed. Corruption in government, with graft, with the indirect election of senators. There's problems in the cities, with the slums, with the municipal governments that are corrupt because they're in political machines, all of these things. And so we need to come in and solve the monopolies and bust the trust and fix the cities. And so because of this, the progressive era is born. We talk a lot about politics in this time period. Where does the progressive era falling? Are there more Republicans? Are there more Democrats, etc.? The best way you define the progressive era is to say that it's more a national mood. It affects both political parties. It is seen as just something that is best for the nation, that it needs to be addressed, especially in the middle class of both parties. The middle class especially are our progressives. What are some of the things that caused the progressive era to be caused? Muckraking is certainly one of those things. And muckraking is reported journalism that is going to expose some of the problems or evils in society. For instance, Scottish photographer Jacob Riis is going to take pictures of the slums in New York and show just how badly, especially the immigrant families, are living in poverty. This is deeply going to affect Teddy Roosevelt, who's a New Yorker himself, to speak out against this treatment of the poor. And it's going to cause change and cause more people to catch that progressive fever. The muckrakers are also going to arouse the public conscious to corruption in government. For instance, Lincoln Steffens is going to write a series of articles called The Shame of the Cities, which is going to expose that many of the municipal governments, the city governments, are beholden to big business, and therefore these political machines in cities need to be addressed. We also see David Phillips, who writes The Treason of the Senate, which exposes the corruption that so many of the senators now are beholden to the railroads and the trusts. There needs to be a change in which senators are directly elected. This is one of many topics that the progressive era is going to address: women trafficking, industrial treatment of their workers, treatment of blacks, the quality of food, the mislabeling of medicines. All of these things are addressed in the progressive era. Who are our progressives? As I mentioned, middle class men and women. And there's kind of two reasons in why the middle class especially become progressives. Above them, we have the big business, the giant corporations that are having a bigger and tighter control over more and more of the nation's wealth. And then in the bottom, we have the workers in the factories, the very, very poor, who are becoming more and more numerous, and they're starting to threaten to become a sizable part of the population that is desiring socialism, a radical change. And so the middle class kind of looks and says, we need to solve the problems above us with the giant corporations, and we also need to solve the problems below us, and so that socialism becomes less appealing to the workers of the world, or certainly the workers of the United States. And so that's where progressivism comes on with the middle class. What are progressives going to work to do? Well, in politics, it's all about rooting out corruption. First of all, direct primary elections so that the people can come in and decide who their candidate for president, for instance, is going to be. Previously, that was decided only by the leaders of the party. Now this could be decided by the people, which makes a ton of sense, obviously. Initiative and referendum, two similar things, where the voters get to propose laws that are on the ballot, and then referendum is voters get to vote on laws for final approval. These are things that were embraced by different states, for instance, California. Being able to recall faithless officials, if officials are not being beholden to the people. That was something that was proposed in the progressive era. And then, of course, getting out graft, which is a huge problem, especially notably with the Grant administration, with the Credit Mobilier scandal. So what were our victories? We did see the states start to adopt new laws that are referendum initiative, and then also limiting the amount that candidates could spend on their own election. They also started to try to restrict corporations giving big gifts to senators to try and keep the senators beholden to them, the trust. The secret ballot, at the time called the Australian secret ballot, we would just know it now as our uniform system of voting, in which someone goes into a poll and it is unknown which party they are part of or how they are voting, because when they arrive with their voting materials, there is no colored envelope that shows that they're going to be voting Republican or Democrat or what have you. That is, the secret ballot is done in secret, and so therefore preventing voter intimidation and those sort of tactics. And then, of course, the big one, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of U.S. senators. It's a long time coming. Since we have been voting for senators all the way back with the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, here we are in 1913, we finally are electing our own senators. Progressivism, one of its biggest victories, definitely in the cities. And we see, especially with work on the slums, Wisconsin is going to kind of lead the way in progressivism, because it is going to look to fight big business in their state, broke up the lumber monopolies, the railroad monopolies, and what's becoming a bigger and bigger monopoly that's going to be addressed in the New Deal era, the 1930s, public utilities. Electricity, as it expands throughout the country, more and more people need electricity every day, and so we see monopolies on that is exploiting the people. And so biggest victories in the cities, and in those cities we also see the settlement house movements. We talked about Jane Addams before with the Hull House. what these settlement houses are doing, because they're run largely by women, is that many middle-class women are getting a chance to come in and engage in politics. We remember that NASA started to use the concept of the cult of domesticity and the separate sphere idea, that women are supposed to be in charge of the moral leaders of society and in charge of motherhood and taking care of the children. And so NASA is going to say, okay, that's all good and fine, but if we're supposed to have a separate sphere as mothers, then we need to have some political power to come in and regulate in things like child labor laws, and to come in and protect our children from going in and working in dangerous factories. And so the settlement house movement directly brings women into politics in a way that we've seen in things like the Second Great Awakening, etc. Florence Kelley, for instance, becomes the state of Illinois' first chief factory inspector. She's going in and inspecting factories to make sure that there is not abuses of the workers. She is going to take control of the National Consumers League, and especially try and protect women and children in the workplace. Mueller v. Oregon is one of those big cases that we look at now as a landmark case at the time, but certainly sexist in today's modern society. This was a view in general, a victory, and viewed in general as a victory for the workers, because it was a Supreme Court case that viewed that there needed to be restrictions in place that protected the workers. But how it was done by today's standards is obviously sexist. The Supreme Court viewed that there should be laws that protect women in the workplace because of their quote unquote weaker bodies. Now, again, at the time period, this was viewed as a victory because it didn't mean that employers had complete sovereignty over their workers in the workplace, that the federal government could come in and force businesses to pass laws or put in place regulations to protect their workers. And these laws needed to come in and help workers, because there were some really nasty incidents, especially in the overcrowded cities, where we see lower class workers it caught in some terrible accidents. The biggest of this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York City. We had a sweatshop, so we have lots of immigrant teenagers, especially immigrant women, that are working in a textile factory, in a sewing factory, and they're up on the top 2 stories of this building that you see here, the Triangle Shirtwaist building. And they're working every single day, multiple days a week. Every single day, multiple hours a day, probably 16 hours a day. And they were supposed to have regulations in place so that if a fire were to break out, that they would be able to evacuate the building. They did have a fire escape, but it was far too narrow. Also, they had locked doors below them, so they couldn't leave. And so as a result, this fire breaks out, and many women are either going to burn to death or jump to their death out of this building. And so it really highlights that there needs to be regulations in businesses that can protect the worker. And so we start to see New York leading the way, regulating the hours and the conditions of sweatshops, and then other states are going to come in and pass laws that are going to give better worker compensation to workers and more protections in the workplace. Also in our progressive era, as always emerges when we see something like reform movements. We have, after the Second Great Awakening, we have our 19th century reforms. One of those reforms, alcohol. Here we have our progressive movement. That's a reform era in the air. And so we have another situation with alcohol. And we see our Women's Christian Temperance Union, which becomes the largest organization of women in the entire world that is going to work to defeat alcohol, the production and sale and manufacture of alcohol. Many states are going to start passing dry laws that prohibit alcohol in their states. And the 18th Amendment is on the horizon. And then we have Teddy Roosevelt and how he contributes to the progressive era and in general. Teddy Roosevelt, his policy is the square deal, not to be confused with Harry S. Truman's fair deal. It is Teddy. You can summarize his domestic agenda in 3 ways: the 3 C's: controlling the corporations, consumer protection and conservation of natural resources. Controlling the corporations is relevant. He got a nickname as a trust buster, but he certainly wanted to control corporations, not bust all of them. He didn't think necessarily that big business was bad. There just needed to be big regulatory agencies in the federal government to be able to keep them contained. Thus, with Teddy Roosevelt, he expands the federal government drastically. He wants to have several bureaucracies that are regulating business all the time. And that is obviously going to expand the role of the government in people's lives. So this is kind of defining the era as the expansion of the federal government. That's why this government, we see this era, we see expansion of the federal government really twice. Now in the progressive era, and then later in the New Deal. And we have the Roosevelts certainly expanding the power of the government. The other time in which Teddy Roosevelt invites people to the White House was with the coal strike of 1902. We saw it previously with the San Francisco School Board. 140,000 Pennsylvania coal miners go on strike because they are not being paid enough. They want shorter work days. The mine owners are going to refuse. Some of the tactics that these mine owners use is say, God has given me control of the property in this state, and therefore I'm going to use it as I see fit. Well, Teddy Roosevelt looks at that and says, that will not fly. And in fact, in these negotiations with these Pennsylvania coal owners, it even got so bad that he said if it wasn't for the graces of his office, he would grab them by the breeches and chuck them out the window. But he didn't do this. He is able to arbitrate a negotiation between the coal miners and the coal owners, and we see a compromise where the miners get 10% pay increase and limiting their workday to 9-hour workday. And this is good because without coal, we saw many of the nation's factories start to shut down. Also, we see with this coal strike of 1902, one of those regulatory agencies that Teddy Roosevelt likes, the Department of Commerce and Labor, to help keep business practices fair between the workers and the owners. In general, we see laws coming in where in this progressive era that are directly start to root out the corruption that emerged in the Gilded Age. The Elkins Act, the government can now fine railroads for giving rebates that were often used as bribes, or the Hepburn Act that restricted free passes that were often given to politicians or journalists. And it also is going to expand the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was established in 1887. Also, Teddy Roosevelt, he's with his trusts. You remember, he doesn't think that all trusts are bad. And this is a big difference between he and Taft and he and Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt believes that there can be good trusts. The bad trusts are the ones that exploit the public for their own gain. He does bust one of J.P. Morgan's trusts, the Northern Securities Company, and because this is one of the first big busts of trust, this is kind of a landmark move because it shows that the government has the power to bust these big businesses, and it shows the American people that the government is willing to do this, and it shows the American people who's in charge. And so Teddy Roosevelt's going to bust 44 trusts in his time as president, which at the time was certainly the most ever. Of course, he's going to be more than doubled by Taft. Also, caring for the consumer, one of the parts of his Square Deal, and especially initiated by the Upton Sinclair book, The Jungle, which is looking at the Chicago meat houses. Upton Sinclair actually was trying to point out the terrible working conditions that the Chicago workers in these slaughterhouses were working in. But ironically, as he said, he missed the nation's heart and hit its stomach because the passages on the meat on the ground and poisoned rats, rope ends, scooped up and canned as potted ham. And when this stuff was read, it hit the nation in the stomach. And it is going to cause an uproar for investigations on the nation's meat. Teddy Roosevelt's going to appoint a special commission to investigate. And as a result, we see two things: the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, where we can federally inspect any shipments that are going through, and the landmark Pure Food and Drug Act that can come in and punish manufacturers for mislabeling or adulterating their food and pharmaceuticals. That's obviously a big one. Conservation. The longest lasting impact of Teddy Roosevelt was conservation. While he doesn't set aside the most land of any president, he is going to make conservation popular and an objective of the federal government. Some of the laws that he signs into law during his presidency, one was the Newlands Act, which is going to collect money for the sale of public lands and then use the money for irrigation, which, especially to the west of that 100th meridian, is going to be badly, badly needed to fund dams throughout the United States that is going to provide irrigation to the sun-baked states, especially in the Southwest, and provide water and power for many Americans living out on the frontier. Also setting aside 125 million acres of forests, reserving millions for coal deposits and protecting the nation's natural resources. His conservation, he was a big-time conservationalist, and this is going to put him, unfortunately, into a conflict with his chosen successor, William Howard Taft. So Teddy is reelected triumphantly and very easily in 1904. This was the last time that William Jennings Bryan ran for president. He defeats him soundly. And he probably could have almost easily become president for a third term, becoming our first third-term president. But after elected for his second time, he says, under no circumstances will I run for a third term. And so because of this, when his second term runs out, he felt bound by his promise. And so he picks William Howard Taft, also of the Republican Party, to come in and carry on his policies. So Taft becomes our next president. And when this happens, we now see a split in the Republican Party because Taft is going to do some things that Teddy doesn't like. All right, let's reflect on Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in general. What did he do? In a time of rising socialism, Teddy Roosevelt is going to exert enough control over big business to protect capitalism in our country. He protects a rising wave of socialism. And so the way that the American pageant puts it is it starts to tame the bucking bronco of adolescent capitalism, thus ensuring its long life into adulthood. And so that's obviously a major contribution in protecting the capitalistic history of our country. Conservation, absolutely huge. Raising the power and the prestige of the president, and of course, the first progressive president. And those are just his domestic achievements. This was obviously one of our most influential presidents. Taft, okay, lots to talk about with Taft. Taft, the one thing we have to know for him internationally is dollar diplomacy. Taft and Wilson are going to move away from Teddy Roosevelt's very hands-on imperialism, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Taft is going to say, yes, we want to control new lands, especially lands with natural resources. However, we don't want to have to send in the Army every time or the Navy every time to go in and gain new lands. Instead, his theory is he's going to encourage rich American investors to buy legally lands in other countries, especially lands controlling resources like oil, so that the U.S. can benefit from this in the long run without having to fight for it. Seems like a good theory. And that's why it's called dollar diplomacy, because he said, we'll send dollars, not bullets. That was the idea behind it. And while this worked in Mexico, he had some embarrassing defeats with dollar diplomacy. One of the things he wanted to do was, because there's still an open door in China, he wanted China to control more of its land so that the United States could benefit from free trade in China. And Japan and Russia had now started to take control of many of the railroads in Manchuria, northern China. And so because of this, Taft is like, hey, we could buy the railroads and this land from Japan and Russia, sell it back to China, make a money on that sale, and then have free trade there. He's rejected. He's rejected by this. It's kind of publicly humiliating. And then he's talking about sending dollars, not bullets, and yet he still has to send forces into Cuba and the Dominican Republic in his presidency. So not really successful. Although, again, one more time, I will mention, very successful in Mexico and buying oil-rich lands there. Okay. We have a split in the Republican Party. The Republican Party has dominated politics from Lincoln's election in 1860 all the way until this time period with Taft in 1912. The only Democratic president that we've had through that entire time span was Grover Cleveland, and Grover Cleveland was a very laissez-faire pro-business president. And so the Republican Party, as I said, is dominated, but the one thing that's going to allow the Democrats back into the White House is this split between the leaders of the Republican Party, Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. Taft is going to break up the U.S. Steel Corporation, which was another J.P. Morgan corporation in which Teddy Roosevelt had personally blessed and endorsed. And so this is obviously going to create embarrassment for Teddy there and a rift there. Taft then is going to sign the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which was very high, after he had promised to lower the tariff. In fact, he had proposed a lower tariff, and then the tariff had gone into Congress, and then all of the business interests had come in and said, yeah, of course you can lower the tariff, just keep the tariff high on our good. Keep the tariff high on our good. And this was argued so many times until eventually the tariff was very, very high, which is going to upset our poorer or our less manufacturing Republicans. And then the most infamous of all, the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Our situation is Taft has appointed a new Secretary of Interior, Richard Ballinger. The Chief of Forestry has been around since Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, and that's Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot is a classic conservationist. He doesn't want any of the land set aside for the nature reserve to be used for the public. But Ballinger, appointed by Taft, is going to open up these reserve lands, especially in Alaska. This is going to horrify Pinchot, who once again was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt. And Pinchot is going to criticize both Taft and Ballinger in public. This is going to really infuriate Taft, who immediately fires Pinchot. This is going to bring Teddy Roosevelt to the defense of his friend and appointee, and they are going to publicly start lashing at each other and cause Teddy Roosevelt to run for the presidency once again in 1912. Okay, who is his Democratic opponent? That's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a Virginia planter. This guy is from a seceded state, and yet he is the governor of New Jersey. And he was a progressive. He believed in the progressive changes that were going on in the era. He gets the endorsement from the probably one of the most popular Democrats at the time, William Jennings Bryan. And he's going to come out with a platform that is much different than that of either Teddy Roosevelt or Taft. He wants stronger antitrust legislation. And I know that sounds very similar, but antitrust legislation means he wants laws in place that forbids trusts. Now, Teddy thinks trusts are okay. There just needs to be regulatory agencies in place. The government needs to expand and control the trust. Wilson says, no, trust should just not even be allowed to form. And so there's a big difference in ideology there. Wilson also wants to reform the banking system. The national banking system has been around since Abraham Lincoln. And when we had the national banking system, the nation was only the northern states because we're in civil war. And so all the banks are in the north. Woodrow Wilson, as a Southerner, is like, no, that's wrong. There needs to be banks in the South as well. And then, of course, he's a Democrat. He wants to reduce the tariffs, which our Democrats always want to do. And so that's Wilson's idea. And now we have Teddy. Teddy is going to throw his hat back into the ring. Taft is the incumbent Republican candidate. We have Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic candidate. And so Teddy is going to run as a third party. He's going to run as the Progressive Party. He has Jane Addams of the Whole House ceremoniously nominate him. It becomes called the Bull Moose Party because Teddy Roosevelt famously calling himself as strong as a bull moose after he shot on the way to deliver a speech in the chest. He still delivers a 90-minute speech. And so because of this, it becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. his platform is new nationalism, and once again, his big difference between he and Wilson is that trusts and unions are okay as long as we have those regulatory agencies in place. He's also very progressive for the time period as he's running on women's suffrage and minimum wage laws. And if you look down at the bottom here, a socialist welfare system for older people who couldn't work. That is the first calls for Social Security, which won't become law until the New Deal. If you look at this electoral college map, with the splitting of the Republican Party, Wilson wins in a landslide in the electoral college. The popular vote, much closer. If you can look, 27.5% of the country voted for Teddy Roosevelt in the Progressive Party. This is the strongest third party showing in American history. But if you can see here, the Democrats won the day. Not all of the South voted for Wilson. That's a huge victory there. Again, he's originally from Virginia. And so that made the difference here. And we have a Democrat in the White House. But it also should be noted that Wilson, despite this strong electoral college showing, only won 42% of the votes. He's a minority president, and he knows it. And so he is going to look, as president in his first term, to sign off on some laws that are going to try to bring more progressives into his camp. He knows he got lucky in this election, and if he's going to be elected again in 1916, he's got to make some political changes. When Wilson comes into the White House, he's looking to attack what he calls his triple wall of privilege. He's going to pass a new tariff that lowers the tariff from those high Republican tariffs. That's called the Underwood Tariff Bill. Lincoln had established a graduated income tax during the Civil War. He was the first president to do that. It was found unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that said that you could establish an income tax, and therefore, if it's unconstitutional and you want to do it, you need to put it in the Constitution. And thus, Wilson is going to work to get the 16th Amendment ratified, which allows an income tax. He immediately reimposes it, which is going to help his party, obviously, as the Democrats tended to be our farmers and our poor, and therefore graduated income tax is going to hit more of the rich, obviously, given that it's graduated. The Wilson is also going to battle the banks. He gets rid of that national banking system established in the Civil War and the Lincoln administration, and he gets the Federal Reserve Act signed and passed. This gives 12 regional reserve districts all throughout the country, not just in the North, as with the national banking system, that is going to allow equal access to currency. He also creates the Federal Reserve Board to oversee them. This becomes the basis of our modern day banking system, which has been obviously very successful, although still no federal insurance of the banks. And so they still could collapse as they did in the Great Depression. That is the final thing to change in the banking system that will occur during the New Deal with FDR. Trust busting, the big law is the Clayton Antitrust Act. Of course, we've still been operating under the Sherman Antitrust Act that passed in 1890. Of course, the problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act is that it was used to break up labor unions. The Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be a Sherman Antitrust Act with teeth. It's going to add a list to bustable offenses, exempting labor from the antitrust persecution. Obviously, that is huge, and Samuel Gompers loves it. He calls it the Magna Carta of labor. Wilson, also trying to cater to progressives, is going to sign some laws that's going to try to bring in more of a voter base to support him. The Federal Farm Loan Act, this is huge. Our farmers have been calling for this since the Populist Party, making credit available to farmers with low interest rates. Farmers love that. Unfortunately, you can see the date on that, 1916. Our farmers now with these low interest loans are going to buy a tremendous amount of land during World War I, this 1916, right in the middle of World War I, and then suffer from overproduction after World War I. Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. That's our first Jew in the Supreme Court. And then the Workmen's Compensation Act, which is going to give federal civil service employees assistance if they are injured or hurt on the job. Lots of things that are very progressive, but the area where Wilson is not progressive is civil rights. We still have a tremendous amount of discrimination going on in the South with Jim Crow laws, etc. And in fact, Wilson is only going to add to this. He increases segregation in the federal bureaucracy, and we see segregation in many federal agencies all the way until Truman at the end of World War II. And so this is obviously not a good thing by Wilson. Wilson, I've said it already, was from Virginia. He's the first president from a seceded state since Zachary Taylor in 1848, far before the Civil War. Okay, Wilson's an anti-imperialist. There's many examples of this because he doesn't like imperialism and he distrusts Wall Street, which is many of our American rich investors. He's going to do away with Taft's dollar diplomacy. He tells American investors, we're no longer going to support you, right? So trying to get rid of dollar diplomacy there. Then the Jones Act, he says the Philippines, you're a territory, and once you reach independence, you will, when you have a stable government, you will reach independence, which becomes true in 1946 on the 4th of July, so 30 years later. And then diffusing a crisis with Japan over a racist California law. Stop me if you've heard this before. California once again being racist towards Asian immigrants, in this case Japanese. We had a group trying to prohibit the Japanese from owning land. Sensibly, Wilson is going to shut this down by sending in William Jennings Bryan, now the Secretary of State, to come in and mediate there. All right, getting to our last part of the lecture. It's been a long lecture. Here we go. So World War I is broken out in 1914. We have the issue in the Balkans Peninsula with Austria-Hungary and Serbia coming to a head and breaking off into a war that pulls in the major powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, England, France, Belgium, all these countries coming into the war. And Wilson sensibly is going to follow the isolationist tradition of the United States established by Washington and stay out of the war. And most Americans, if they had to pick a side, were anti-German. Kaiser Wilhelm, with his evil-looking mustache and his movement through neutral Belgium to start the war to begin with. And so if there was a sentiment, it would be anti-German. However, we know that there's a high percentage of German nationals in the United States. Roughly 8% of the country is of German descent, so a high minority in that case. But why does the U.S. eventually support the Allies, in this case, the Russians, the British, and the French? One of which is economic reasons. British and French war orders, or constantly needing weapons, munitions, guns. So we have lots of trade with Britain and France, and almost exclusively Britain and France after the British blockade Germany. In the beginning, the U.S. is trading with both sides, making tremendous profits. But once the British blockade Germany, we have much more going to Britain and France. Therefore, the U.S. has an economic vested interest in the success of the Allies. J.P. Morgan himself loans $2.3 billion to Britain and France. And then we start to see the policy of the Germans start to sink neutral ships. The Lusitania was a British ocean liner, 128 Americans on board. That caused a huge uproar to go to war with Germany, in which Wilson temporarily quells. The Arabic, another British ship with 2 Americans on board, and then the Sussex, which was a French ship with Americans on board. And finally, Wilson is going to make the Germans accept the Sussex Pledge, which said you cannot sink merchant vessels without warning. You are killing Americans, and if you continue to do this, we are going to go to war against you. And so when that election of 1916 comes around, Wilson is going to run largely on the platform that he kept the U.S. out of the war. This is going to be popular enough to squeak out a victory against the Republican candidate Charles Evan Hughes. And then, of course, Wilson's going to proceed to jump right into the war in 1917, because there is lots of reasons by the Germans to join this war, one of which is the Germans announced unrestricted submarine warfare. We are going to sink any ship that enters the waters of Britain and France, regardless of its flag, because the Germans at this stage are trying to starve out the British, and they cannot do that if American merchants continue to bring foodstuffs there. And so because of this we start to see more and more American merchant vessels sank. Then the Zimmerman note comes about, where Arthur Zimmerman, the German diplomat, is going to send a telegram to Mexico, saying that if the United States did join the war, that if Mexico came in and fought on the side of the Germans, that after the war, the Germans would help the Mexicans recover land lost to them by the Mexican-American War. This will not fly by the United States, and Wilson is going to ask for war on April 2nd, 1917. The area of the United States most resistance to going to war is going to be our Midwest for two reasons. They're less affected by merchant ships being sunk. They're landlocked. They're in the middle of the United States. And then also because that's the area where the most German descendants are living. Okay, how does Wilson get the United States behind going to a war with Germany, in which we really have some very, very weak reasons for going to war? Of course, by saying it is a war to make the world safe for democracy. He outlines this wonderful post-war plan in which we are no longer going to have secret treaties. We'll have freedom of the seas. We're going to reduce arms. Self-determination. All people, all colonies around the world will be able to decide how their state will be run, all of these things. And then, of course, the League of Nations to prevent future wars. So he comes out with this wonderful outline of making the world safe for democracy. But while that is embraced by many Americans, there are many Americans that are anti-war. And so this is our first war where we use propaganda to try and get Americans on board with the war. The Committee of Public Information, headed by George Creel, is going to post and print millions of posters and leaflets and pamphlets. We're going to have the 4-Minute Men coming in between the changing of movie reels in the theaters, coming out and trying to inspire Americans to hate the Germans, to go at war against the Germans. In fact, these were the era of our very, very first movies, which were almost all anti-German propaganda. And so lots of propaganda, obviously, by the United States. And then there's still people that are going to speak out against the war. And so we are going to enact some laws. Congress is going to enact some laws that quite steeply infringe upon American civil liberties. The two laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act of 1917 says it is illegal to convey information that is intended to interfere with the United States war effort or promote the success of the country's enemies. And that can be something along the lines of, oh, I really dislike the draft. I refuse to go in and fight this war over American economic interests or what have you. If you said that, you could be persecuted under the law, fined $10,000 or even thrown into jail. Also, the Sedition Act, sedition is like treachery, illegal to make false statements that interfered with the war effort. The group that was persecuted the most by these laws were the Wobblies, our kind of our socialist labor union that is going to dislike the war and protest the war, and especially protest the draft. The Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States, this is a big one. It says, yes, these laws are clearly infringing upon Americans' First Amendment rights. However, freedom of speech can be revoked when the speech presents a clear and present danger to the nation. So legally oppressing Americans' rights in this case. We entered that war, World War I, unprepared for war, and for a lot of reasons. One, the Army was still only 100,000 men. That's probably the 16th largest army in the world, kind of tied with Persia at the time, modern-day Iran. So not the war power that we see in World War II, certainly. And then economic mobilization, the key to victory in World War II, a shadow of itself in World War I, because the ignorance of how much we could produce, and because we're still afraid of the power of big government coming in and telling which factories to produce what and setting production quotas and price controls and all these things, the federal government didn't take nearly as much of a direct control over the economy, and thus we produced far less than we could have produced as we did in World War II. The industry that came in and started to create and regulate the economy at this stage was called the War Industries Board. It did take over the railroads for a period, but largely was not nearly as strong as it was in World War II. labor was a focus by the federal government in the war because the U.S. government knew that laborers going on strike was bad for the war effort. We needed to continue to produce weapons of war, guns, tanks, what have you. And so the National War Labor Board was created for this exact purpose. We are going to make employers work to keep their workers satisfied so that we can continue to produce goods. This is going to satisfy the AFL. The AFL is going to support the war, but as I mentioned, the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, our socialist union of the country, does not support the war, and many of them are prosecuted under the Sedition Acts and for treachery, I guess. The AFL doubles in membership after the war because of their support for the war. The Steel Strike. Now, notice the date, 1919. So we are right after the war here, and this is where we see the biggest strike in American history. People largely kept striking or stopped striking during the war, but as soon as the war ends, this is our biggest strike in American history. It's across 15 states. Almost 300,000 steel workers went on strike, and without the help of the federal government, we see that this strike is going to collapse. It's going to fall apart, and the union movement, the labor movement, is weakened by this. It says crippled for more than a decade. It's not going to be until the New Deal where we see real protections of labor, like the Wagner Act, protecting unions in a big way. The war is also going to split the women's movement. We've seen women tirelessly campaigning for more political rights. And this is World War I is going to be the catalyst that gets women the right to vote. With the men going off to fight in the war, thousands of female workers come into the factories and the fields to take their jobs and keep those businesses running. We have two women's groups that are going to be split on the women's movement. The National Women's Party, it's led by Alice Paul, who is a Quaker, therefore inherently anti-war. And then we have NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, that did advocate for women to come in and take part in the war. But it's actually the one that is not participating in the war, the National Women's Party, that does the most direct good towards women's suffrage, because we see our silent sentinels, such as Alice Paul, that are going to come out and protest outside the White House, calling President Wilson Kaiser Wilson, and how can you send our nation to war when half the country can't vote on our elected representatives who are sending us out to war. And so they've got obviously a good point on that one, and they start to protest and protest and protest. Finally, they're arrested for protesting under the Sedition Acts. They're thrown in jail, and then they stop eating in jail. They go on hunger strikes. The government starts to force feed them. This starts to get out into the public. The Boston Globe has the story. They're going to publish it. They leverage this with Wilson to get him to support the women's effort. And thus, Wilson comes out and says, women's suffrage is vitally necessary war measure. In 1917, New York is going to be our first Eastern state to embrace women's suffrage. And by then, it starts to stem the flow until we have the necessary 2/3 vote in order to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which we do in 1920, all American women with the right to vote. Okay. About 6-7 more slides. Here we go. So more agencies in the federal government here. Herbert Hoover does his best work with the Food Administration. He does not believe, and we know this from his presidency, he does not believe in forcing people to do anything. He doesn't believe that the federal government should be coming in and interacting directly in people's lives. But he says that if you ask people to do things, that they will do it. And that's what his Food Administration was all about. He popularized, using propaganda, things like Wheatless Wednesdays and Meatless Tuesdays and Victory Gardens. All of these things were to preserve food so that you could send it overseas to the men and women fighting abroad. Farm production is going to increase. We're going to send more exports to the Allies, which of course is going to benefit the war effort in a big way. Also, because more of this food was supposed to be used to producing for food and not to be used to producing alcohol. This is going to be another blow to alcohol, and that is going to cause the 18th Amendment finally to be ratified, prohibiting alcohol, and that's what we'll see the 1920s in our prohibition era. Fuel administration, another bureaucracy that is going to advocate things like heatless Mondays and gasless Tuesdays to save oil for the war, obviously. And then a reminder that the way in which you fund wars, obviously you raise taxes, although not if you're LBJ in Vietnam, but another way that you fund the war, and the way in which the U.S. made the most money in all of our wars, is by borrowing. That is how the U.S. funds wars. The Victory Loan Campaign is one such example. When you think about borrowing, a lot of students get confused by this. They're like, oh, what countries are we borrowing from? If you're in a world war, who can possibly spare money? We borrow from our own people. We sell bonds, right? And bonds are promises that the U.S. government will pay back its citizens with interest. This is going to raise $21 billion, which is 2/3 of the war cost. What is going on here? Okay. Come on. Log in here for a second. Oh my goodness. What is going on? Okay, here we go. So the draft. So the Selective Service Act, Wilson was against it, but began to see it as a necessary part of the war. We have males 18 to 45 having to register for the Selective Service Act and then could be drafted. This is, and World War II are fair drafts in history. We know that the Civil War was drastically unfair and the Vietnam War was drastically unfair, but in the World War, we do it right in the sense that there's no purchase exemptions. You can't hire a substitute. And it was more difficult to get out of the draft than it was in Vietnam. Women weren't drafted, but they could come serve in non-combat positions. African Americans served, but mostly in segregated units, all in segregated units, and mostly in non-combat positions like constructions and fortifications, etc. The Germans are going to surrender in late 1918. They're looking for a surrender on the idea of Wilson's 14 points. Wilson says, okay, I'm willing to do that, but I'm not going to negotiate with the Kaiser. The Kaiser is exiled to Holland, and so it's 11-11-18, apparently on the 11th hour when this armistice is signed. No more fighting. What were the major contributions to the war effort? Was it battlefield victories? No, it wasn't. The major contributions were food, munitions, and credit, and the prospect that if the war continued, more and more American troops would pour into Europe. Okay, Wilson is riding high after this victory. We've only really come in and done any fighting for just about a year, and yet we have gotten a lot of victory, a lot of credit for the success of the victory. And so now Wilson is looking to help shape the post-war world. And so he knows he's going to go and negotiate with the other leaders of the world on a treaty. And so he really wants, when he comes back, to have a Congress there that is going to ratify his treaty. And so he's going to call for a Democratic victory in the congressional elections, and this backfires. And this is tragically backfires for Wilson because Republicans take the Congress and they're going to deeply fight him on his treaty. He goes to Paris himself. It was called grandstanding. He's the first American president to leave to Europe as a sitting president. And then when he takes with him a peace delegation, he takes not a single Republican. And there's one he should have taken, which was the new Senate chairman on foreign relations, his biggest adversary in Congress, Henry Cabot Lodge, the other academic in Congress. Wilson's going to negotiate with three other men: Vittorio Orlando from Italy, David Lloyd George from Britain, and George Clemenceau from France. These four made up the Big Four. They are, of course, the winners in World War I. Vittorio Orlando is actually going to storm out of the conference when Italy isn't given land as a result of the war. And because of this, it really comes down to Wilson, David Lloyd George of Britain, and George Clemenceau of France. Britain and France both are insistent that Germany must be punished for this war, for starting this war, they said. Although, of course, the first declaration of war was Austria-Hungary on Serbia. Germany gets a really bad rep for this one because they had the first invasion of the war. And so Wilson is the one that insists we cannot be too hard on Germany, but the other two outnumber him and they outweigh him in their um, arguments. And so Wilson really wants to get his 14 points added into the Treaty of Versailles, but is forced to compromise as these negotiations go on. And so Wilson is going to bring back a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, only having only having 4 of his points. But the point he is most proud of is in there, and that is the League of Nations. And when he returns home in 1919, he says, here is the Treaty of Versailles. It is perfect. We need to ratify this. But the Republicans now sitting in control of Congress are not going to let this happen. The spited Henry Cabot Lodge is going to read the entire 264-page document aloud. This delays and divides people on their opinion of it. Wilson, to combat this, goes on a speaking tour around the country where he's giving speeches each and every night. He is frail. He is getting older now. In 1919, he collapses in Colorado with a stroke. Literally, it is killing him of the stress of getting this treaty ratified. When he is debilitated, Henry Cabot Lodge is going to write a very spiteful document called the 14 Formal Reservations, which is obviously a play on Wilson's 14 points, where he criticizes Wilson's 14 points. He especially criticizes the Article 10 in the Treaty of Versailles, which states that if the U.S. joined the League of Nations, that they would be morally bound to respond if a country was invaded by another country. This says, as Lodge says it, and he's got a good point, that if the U.S. would be morally bound to go in and protect another country, this would be directly violating the Americans' isolationist tradition established by Washington's farewell address. Therefore, this is going to cause a division. Cabot Lodge is going to add a series of amendments to the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson hates that he's added these amendments. He says, Democrats, I am asking you to vote down this Treaty of Versailles with these new amendments. It is voted down. It is put up for re-election. Wilson again tells Democrats to vote it down. Once again, it is voted down. The Treaty of Versailles is not ratified. The U.S. does not join the League of Nations. And this feud between Henry Cabot Lodge and Wilson is going to really stop the U.S. from joining the League of Nations or even officially creating a peace between the U.S. and Germany. At this stage, the U.S. is technically still at war in Germany. Of course, there's no fighting. And that's is where we end for today. A very long lecture on a Saturday. I hope that you guys break it down into a couple of little bite-sized chunks. But of course, it's very important information, guys. So please take it seriously. Conspicuously, there are no SAQs at the end of this. You are not required to do SAQs for this, only the DBQ outline at the end. And again, for the DBQ outline on tomorrow's lecture, if you write an essay and time yourself, it will be an automatic 3 out of 3. Bye, guys. See you tomorrow.